With the coming of American rule, these indigenous people faced one of the darkest periods in U.S. history, when Jim Crow laws relegated so many Americans to second-class status. This is their story.
The Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945 was the first anti-discrimination law in the nation, about 20 years before the Civil Rights Movement accomplished the same in the lower 48.
Elizabeth and Roy Peratrovich, as Grand Camp presidents of the Alaska Native Sisterhood and Brotherhood, were the only Native Alaskans who testified before the territorial legislature on behalf of the bill.
The roots for the Anti-Discrimination Act were laid on October 18, 1867, when Alaska became a territory of the United States. Under Russian rule, they were considered citizens, so they assumed that would hold true in their new country.
Unfortunately, the wording of the Treaty of Sale ensured that only civilized tribes would be given U.S. citizenship rights.
Soon after Alaska became a territory, American authorities began an aggressive campaign of discrimination against Alaska Natives. Education, but few, if any, qualified, regardless of their levels of education and assimilation.
This left many frustrated and outraged that they could not gain acceptance as equals in American society. In 1912, the Alaska Native Brotherhood, with the Alaska Native Sisterhood 3 years later, was formed to focus this frustration into an anti-discrimination campaign.
During the 1940s, in the midst of World War II, Elizabeth and Roy Peratrovich became the leaders of this movement. In 1943, the territorial legislature considered the act for the first time.
The testimony on the floor was overwhelmingly negative. A senator said it would take 30 to 100 years before any Indian can associate with a white man. Another senator said Indians have not yet reached a sufficiently high level of culture to be considered a civilized people.
The Anti-Discrimination Act did not pass. Still, Elizabeth and Roy lobbied tirelessly. Then, the pivotal day of testimony arrived.
Mixed breeds are the source of the trouble. It is only when they wish to associate with the whites. It had been better if the Eskimos had put up signs saying no whites allowed. This is simply an effort to create political capital for some legislators. Certainly the women have been doing their part in keeping the races distinct, but if white men had been doing the same, there'd be no racial feeling in Alaska.
I'd like to speak in support of Senator Scott. The Eskimos of St. Lawrence Island have not suffered the white man's evil and are well off. The pure Eskimos are not an inferior race, but they're an individual race. The pure Eskimos are proud of their origin and are aware of the harm that comes from them from mixing with whites. It is the mixed breed who is not accepted by either race that causes trouble. I believe in racial pride and do not think this bill will do other than arouse bitterness. Why we should prohibit the sale of liquor to these natives is the real root of our troubles.
I'm also against the Equal Rights Bill. I would prefer to not sit next to these natives in the theater. Truthfully, they smell bad.
I'm personally assailed by Senator Whaley's remarks. I stand in support of the Equal Rights Bill. Discrimination does exist. In Nome, an Eskimo was forcibly removed from a theater when she dared to sit in the white section. And I have a list of similar occurrences based solely on my experiences that would occupy the full afternoon to relate.
I too would like to state my support for this legislation. I know of no instance where a Native died of a broken heart, but I do know situations where discrimination has forced a Native woman into situations worse than death.
I would like to remind the legislature that the Honorable Ernest Gruning, in his report to the Secretary of the Interior, as well as his message to the legislature, has recognized the existence of discrimination. Even the plank adopted by the Democratic Party at its Fairbanks convention favors the Equal Rights Bill. In fact, members of that committee are present in the Senate body.
Mr. Peratrovich, as I've mentioned to you before, the bill will aggravate rather than allay the little feelings that now exists. Our native cultures have 10 centuries of white civilization to encompass a few decades. I believe that considerable progress has already been made, particularly in the last 50 years, but still progress needs to be made.
Only an Indian can know how it feels to be discriminated against. Either you are for discrimination or you're against it, accordingly as you vote on this bill.
This legislation is wrong. Rather than being brought together, the races should be kept further apart. Who are these people? Barely out of savagery, who wants to associate with us, whites, with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind us?
I would have not expected that I, who am barely out of savagery, would have to remind the gentlemen with 5,000 years of civilization recorded behind them of our Bill of Rights. When my husband and I came to Juneau and sought a house in a nice neighborhood where our children could play happily with our neighbors' children, we found such a house and we arranged to lease it. When the owners learned that we were Indians, they said no. Would we be compelled to live in the slums?
Will this law eliminate discrimination?
Do your laws against larceny, rape, and murder prevent those crimes? No law will eliminate crimes, but at least you, legislators, can assert to the world that you recognize the evil of the present situation and speak of your intent to help overcome discrimination. There are three kinds of persons who practice discrimination. First, the politician who wants to maintain an inferior minority group. Second, the Mr. and Mrs. Jones who quite aren't sure of their social position and who are nice to you on one occasion and can't see you on others, depending on whom they are with. And third, the great Superman who believes in the superiority of the white race. The super race attitude is wrong and forces our fine native people to associate with less than desirable circumstances. That evening, Elizabeth and Royce celebrated by dancing the night away in the ballroom of the Baranoff Hotel. The no native sign had already disappeared.
On February 8, 1945, the Senate voted 11-5 in favor of the bill, and the governor, Ernest Gruening, signed it into law February 16th. It was the first anti-discrimination law in the nation.
Years later, Gruening said that without Elizabeth Peratrovitch's eloquent testimony, the measure would not have passed.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into the law 19 years after Alaska's anti-discrimination law.
So we take this day to remember and say,
thank you, Elizabeth Peratrovich. And remember, stay tuned to the cutting edge. Chair ain't never gonna get me, 'cause when I get low, whoa, I get high. Ooh, ah. Ooh, ah. God is barely in a tangle, 'cause I'm a slice of pie he just can't handle, and when I get low